everyone. Thanks for coming to Forum. Looks like we have a screen, so that's all the better. A couple housekeeping things. If we could consider moving everyone to the center section. Looks like most of you are here, so that's great. That kind of helps us all focus our energy to Sky and vice versa. And then also for Q&A, today we're going to have questions from a stand, a microphone down here in front. That'll just help our live streaming folks just know who is speaking. So if you want to, you can turn around and say hi to the cameras. Some upcoming events next week on the 1st. We have Polly Hubbard and the MGNL grantees will be here. On the 8th, we have Naomi Lopez and Charles Johnson. They are the president and co-chair of Neighbors for Education. They'll be talking about D11 school board politics, upcoming election, so you won't want to miss that. And then in light of today's sermon, on the 15th, we will have the El Paso County Suicide Prevention Collaborative. So that's very relevant right now. So Dr. Foerster is with us today.
Egads, who's that?
We all know him as Sky.
Thanks for being here. Before we start, I want to make an announcement about something unrelated to this. As you know, and many of you have been involved in this since August of 2021, we have been working with and helping with an Afghan family, a large extended family, Ghulam Khan's extended family. And I just learned this week that Bazgul, we were over there yesterday, and they have all received asylum. Now, I've also written that, these folks, until they receive asylum, are humanitarian parolees, not refugees, and they have no permanent status in this country. And they are subject to being deported depending upon whoever's making immigration policy in the White House. I'm not going to say any more than that. But with asylum, they have some certainty and permanence, and they are allowed to be here as long as the reasons for their asylum, principally they get shot when they go home, as long as those reasons are real. And they will be, I'm sure, for a long time, unfortunately. And a year from now, they can start the application for a green card and permanent residency. But this is all really good news, and I wanted to share that with, because there are many of you in this room who continue to volunteer and work with these folks. This is an update. Rob asked me to give an update on Ukraine and the war. I gave a talk about a year ago, and as I'm going to point out in a second, not a lot's changed, unfortunately. Whoop, Rachel wants me to. Okay. All right, good. Sorry, then I'm just been told I'm going to have to say next slide because I'm not controlling the screen. What's on the slide? But I want to preface this with, it's a little odd perhaps to talk, we've just been talking about Just Peace, and Mike last week was Just Peace Sunday. Mike Williams was here from Citizens Project. Leanne just talked about the importance of just peace and justice and peace. So why are we talking about a war? Why don't we just end the war? And I really want to get at that question today as I kind of lay out where things are in this war. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about where are we now. What kind of progress in Ukraine's counteroffensive that is now running 3 months long, although it's sometimes hard to tell when it started, and sometimes hard to tell whether it's still going on. What's happening with weaponry, because there's a lot of talk about weapons from the West, including the United States. A lot of talk about Russia's defenses and how strong they are. I want to talk a little bit about the political climate in the West. Zelensky has been running around. He was in the UN this week. He's been meeting with everybody that will meet with him. They are naysayers in the U.S. Congress, and I want to talk a little bit about how strong that movement is. And there are some jitters amongst our allies, so there is uncertainty here, and I want to touch on all of those things. I'm going to say a little bit about a lot of these things and leave room for Q&A. I'm going to say a little bit about the political climate in Russia. You all know that Prigozhin, the founder and the head of the Wagner Group, his airplane fell out of the sky surreptitiously. And there's some changes in the Russian military, and kind of what is Putin's strategy anyway, which is summarized as hold out until 2025 and hope things change. And the real question is, where do we go? We go from here, and alas, this is just like I said a year ago, this is a waiting game. This is a stuck war. It's a slog. It's a war of attrition. And the variables have a lot to do with what goes on in Ukraine, but the variables principally are how solid the West holds together, particularly U.S. political direction in 2024, and whether there's upheaval or stability in Russia. And I forgot to say next slide. So now go to the next slide. All right, I know you can't read this. This is the slide I showed a year ago. But this is a recap of what happened in 2022. And if you notice up on the left, right after the invasion, the Russian invasion, they had a lot of Ukrainian territory, all that red stuff. And then within 6 weeks, they'd lost it. By May, things stabilized. There was a counteroffensive in September from Ukraine, took back a chunk of territory on the north, and Kherson in the south, and so on. And that map, the reason I show that, a lot of things happened in 2022, and if you just kind of hold that last map in your mind, it looks about the same as it does today, because that's as of yesterday. Nothing on the ground has fundamentally changed since we had this conversation about a year ago. Ukraine has been mobilizing forces and getting a lot of equipment that it didn't have before, augmenting its troop levels and so on, and has launched this counteroffensive with the goal of cutting the land bridge between Crimea and Russia, and what Russia held before or after 2014, but before 2022, to get to the Sea of Azov, which is that gray area just northeast of the Crimean Peninsula. This is about exhausting the Russian army. This is not about defeating them in open pitched battle, because there aren't many open pitched battles. This is slogging through mud and trees and urban warfare in cities that, well, they're cities and villages and towns, but they're basically totally destroyed, and there's nobody living there. The punchline here is Ukraine is not going to defeat the Russian army in the way that we think in the West of defeating an army or defeating the Nazi army in World War II or whatever. This is about causing that army to fall apart and not succeed in a way that people back in Moscow decide that the politics no longer favor continuing this war. And I hasten to add what you already know, if you're reading anything, is that there is no evidence that Moscow is anywhere near that at this point. There are three main axes of attack, and there's also, and I'll show you another map of this, but recently, particularly over the last few weeks, but some pretty dramatic ones earlier this year, attacks against Crimea. Most of these are by drones, and for the most part, I mean, they're not fundamentally changing the Russian military capability or damaging substantially the Russian Navy that's based in Sevastopol in Crimea. But it is to remind the Russians in Crimea that they are not immune from this war. But of course, the problems, as I've listed there, is that the other thing that has happened over the course of the last year is that the Russian army has dug in, and it is hard. This will, next slide. these are really confusing charts, but what I want to show you is that the arrows are pointing to the same place, so you can get some kind of orientation of geography. But the point is that there are pushes in the north, there are pushes in the middle in Donetsk, and that's where Bakhmut is, and that's where those arrows in the top are a town that has been totally devastated, but a key intersection of lines of communication, and along in the west, and targets in Crimea. But the point of all of this, not that you understand the details and see all of that, right? I was trying to figure out how does this map mix with this map, is that the light blue is progress that the Ukrainians have made over the last few weeks. They have begun, now where this goes, who knows, but they have begun to find some places where they have been able to break through. Now you see a couple of these maps, there are fortifications, not only heavy entrenchments, makes it hard to run tanks and armored vehicles through entrenched areas, and there are whole areas that just littered with landmines, and that's going to be a problem for Ukraine later. But littered with landmines, which means Ukraine cannot do the thing that most Americans, and particularly American military, think about when they think counteroffensive. They think about a blitzkrieg. They think about massive tanks charging across the battlefield, punching through the lines and all the rest of it. Not happening. Not happening. Increasingly, these are small unit forays. Lots of artillery exchanges and artillery barrages, and the real variable there is my artillery got a bigger range than yours. So I can hit you with my spitball, but your spitballs don't hit me. And that's basically what's going on. And it takes pounding of these fortifications to get them broken, to get the landmines to go off, small units going in, clearing areas so that you can then send some armored vehicles through. And so you read things about Bakhmut has been taken, and then now a village, they've taken it back, and so on. These are, and I'll show you a picture in a second of what Bakhmut looks like. There's nobody there. It's just a bunch of destroyed buildings. And this is tough warfare. It's not going anywhere. And the biggest takeaway from this, as I read a lot of military pundits from the United States and from the West, the West hasn't fought a war like this since 1944. We don't know, this is not anything like what the West has fought, what the United States has fought. This is not like Iraq. This is not like Kosovo. This is not like anything we have done, because we believe in overwhelming force, moving quickly, punching through, and getting the job done quickly as best we can. And of course, we haven't been fighting against a superior, in terms of numbers, military, like the Ukraine has. Next slide. Prospects on the ground. There are some changes that are going to happen. There have been some F-16s that have been introduced from allies and now from us, and Afghan pilots are being trained on them. This will give them better reach. It was announced this week that the United States has now agreed to send a small number of ATACMS, that stands from Army Tactical Missile Systems. The point of that is it's a missile system that is guided and has a 190-kilometer range. That is going to be very helpful in being able to strike Russian supplies in Ukraine, but at the end of, right inside the border of Ukraine. And we have so far said to Ukraine, you may not use any of our weapons to strike targets in Russia. Now, they have struck targets in Russia, but that's Ukrainian weapons, mostly drones in Moscow, and so on. And some Abrams tanks are due to arrive. Again, not in large numbers. German Leopard tanks have been there for some time. But of course, this all runs up against the timeline. Winter's coming, mud, the weather. It's going to hinder air operations. It's going to hinder ground operations. But on the other hand, it also makes the Russian soldiers more vulnerable, because the Russian soldiers are not as motivated as the Ukrainian soldiers. Many of them have been mobilized, drafted, conscripted, bribed to get out of prison, go to the front lines, and what have you. And the colder it gets, the more nasty it gets, the more they are going to be the less they're going to be motivated to fight. And that is part of what Ukraine's hope is, that the Russian army itself will just not fight very well. Next slide. And of course, the last line on this slide, outcomes uncertain. You see, that's the punchline of the whole thing, right? We don't know what's going to happen. The real question is the Western consensus sustainable? And I've got here from the NATO summit in July, we will remain steadfast in our commitment to further step up political and practical support to Ukraine as it continues to defend its independent sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And that phrase is important. And we'll continue our support for as long as it takes, whatever it is. We haven't defined the it. That's the big question, right? And also, there's nothing in there about NATO membership. Except further down in the communique, there's some assurances that we'll get around to it at some point. The chart, which you probably can't read, but basically that shows humanitarian aid. In fact, I can maybe go to the next slide. Not all of this is military aid. The top line is the European Union, and that's almost all humanitarian and non-military aid. The U.S. is there's the number 2 bar, and you'll see the red is military assistance, weaponry, 61%, but the remainder is humanitarian and general economic support. Political opinion is still supporting in the United States. There have been various polls that show it's softening, but I would say it's still roughly 2-to-1 in favor of support, 60-40, 65-35, in favor of continuing to support Ukraine. You have to read the exact question in the poll to kind of figure out some of the differences, but the support is there. But it's increasingly a polarized partisan support. So those who say they're Democrats, of course, independents are about 40% of the electorate. But the Democrats are about 70, 80% in support of continuing Ukraine. Republicans are a bare majority. On the Hill, as I'm sure you've all been reading, there is a request as part of the budget package that may not get passed, and we all may have a government shutdown before the week's out. There is a $24 billion additional request for aid to Ukraine. We've given about $77 billion already. There are 28 members of Congress just signed a letter saying they're opposing this request, and there's not the only ones that have opposed it. For example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's made very clear that she's opposed it. She's not a part of that letter for whatever reason. 6 in the Senate, 22 from the House, all Republicans. No one from Colorado has signed that letter. It is not a foregone conclusion, is my point, that American support for continuing aid to Ukraine is sustainable. And in part, I think it is because we had great expectations of a Ukrainian offensive. We're going to give them all this stuff, and they're going to make a punch through in the fall, and all is going to be well. And it didn't work out that way for all the reasons that I've mentioned to you. And our expectations of that offensive, I think, were exaggerated from the beginning. The Allies are still in there. Germany is the line below the United States, then the UK, the strongest supporters of military equipment. The UK is running into some funding problems, but the Germans are beginning to step up. As I mentioned last time, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said right after the invasion happened, he made really a groundbreaking speech talking about Germany's Zeitenwende, which was a new direction in his foreign and security policy, substantial new investments in defense. Germany will be above 2% of GDP in defense next year. But it's taken a long time to get stuff moving. But some of that is beginning to come to the fore. The French have lagged back. They're even on the list. Why they're not on that list, I have to talk to the Kiel Institute. They have not provided as much in terms of military support. They are mostly with funding much of the EU support that is non-military. They did provide some air defense stuff earlier this summer, but Macron is also angling to try and kind of find for himself some independent role, and he's beginning to speak about, you know, we need to depend upon ourselves in Europe, and for everybody else in Europe, that means you want us to depend on you, right? Poland has been the largest neighbor in terms of support, and they have been huge. They've always been the greatest supporter of Ukraine, but there is a grain dispute. There is, because Ukraine cannot export much grain to the Black Sea, although they did get a couple shipments out this week, they want to sell more in Europe, and protectionism in Europe is still alive and well. And Poland is having elections, as is Slovakia, and they want to cater to their own farmers and not to the Ukrainian farmers. So there is a temporary hiccup in that. Nobody I know thinks Poland is just going to stop supporting Ukraine. The punchline here, though, is in green. Much will depend on the United States. I do believe, and this is clear within NATO deliberations and everyone I've talked to, that without U.S. leadership, support for Ukraine will begin to unravel. Without U.S. leadership within NATO countries believing the United States will inevitably disengage, or we have to plan on that possibility, that increasingly possibility, that we'll have to hedge our bets. That's not going to be good for Europe. It's not going to be good for us. So I still keep coming back to this notion that much will depend on us. Next slide, please. Meantime, as you've heard this week, Zelensky's been running around. He spoke to NATO. He spoke to the G20 earlier this year. He was at the UN. He went to D.C. He met with Congress. He went to Ottawa. He spoke very, sharply at the UN Security Council that the UN has failed, pointing to the continued Russian veto. The Security Council can't do anything about Ukraine because of the way the UN Security Council is checked. You all learned that in high school civics. And as he said to Congress, without U.S. support, Ukraine loses the war. And I think, to go back to that other slide, you don't need to, but you know how much it all depends on what the United States is providing. And the political cover. For example, Germany only provided Leopard tanks to Ukraine after we promised that we would provide Abrams, even if it was just one. I mean, it provides political cover in a very dicey political coalition in Germany, which is also beginning to have some local elections, Länder elections next week. Zelensky has done a lot to focus on anti-corruption at home. They just fired his defense minister and 9 deputy defense ministers this year. All of the regional recruitment directors have been fired because they were taking bribes for, we would normally send you to war, but if you give me some money, you don't need to go to war, kinds of things. All of them got fired. It was a big cleaning house last January as well. He's got on the books a peace plan, which is pretty much zero-sum. The Russians have to get out, restore all our territory, release all the prisoners. Putin needs to be held accountable for war crimes, et cetera, et cetera. That's not really a basis for negotiation, but it is, it is his starting point. And of course, Lavrov, as late as the other day at the UN, said this is not even, there's nothing to negotiate about. Next slide, please. The question here is, can Putin stay the course? I mean, this is a war of attrition, but as much as a war of attrition on the ground, it's a war of attrition of politics. Who's going to blink first, Putin or the United States, politically? And Putin is banking on that once New Year's 2025 comes around, there's going to be a new face in the White House, and that new face in the White House and the new politics of the U.S. Congress are going to be such that the United States support for Ukraine will just take a nosedive, and with that, everything else will unravel, and we will be able to overwhelm and overcome whatever Ukraine has with us, and we will have our way with Kyiv. A lot of speculation after the attempted coup by Prigozhin that this was really a big crack in Putin's foundation, but turned out that Putin actually reasserted control. There's a lot of interesting articles that say Putin is stronger, Putin is weaker. I would suggest that in the long term, in the near term, he's scared the heck out of everybody. In the longer term, it's demonstrated that he is vulnerable, he is weaker, but that also makes him more dangerous. But that's, you know, that's my assessment. It was an interesting article I read earlier this week that was looking only at, it was from the French Institute of International Relations, only looking at traffic within military communications channels. They're essentially their email and text traffic. And the papers they're writing and what they're saying within war colleges. And so this is what Russian military leaders are very critical about, how this war has just wasted a lot of stuff and a lot of people. Russians have over 120,000 dead and another 180,000 wounded. And those numbers, that's about 1.7 to 1 is the ratio to Ukraine. Ukraine is about 70 or 80,000 dead and about a little over 100,000 wounded. So it's bad on both sides, but the Russians are losing a lot, and they continue to lose a lot, and it's hard to mobilize resources. Ukraine is not having trouble mobilizing its own people to defend themselves. In fact, when I read something the other day, and it said, well, at the end of the day, the people need to speak. Well, the people in Ukraine are speaking. They don't want anything given up. The more and more Russia destroys in Ukraine, the more and more the Ukrainian people say it's all or nothing. There is some adaptability to the battlefield. We have a separate conversation about drones and all the rest of it. But basically, the Russian military themselves is saying to themselves, we've had some really systemic failures. By the way, the picture at the bottom is Bakhmut. That's all that's left. It's just a shell of apartment buildings and high-rises. Next slide, please. I have to adapt my own slide, right? Russian public opinion, it's not pro-war, but for the most part, particularly in rural areas, there's only one source of information. They tolerate the war. There is an appeal to nationalism. The Russian Orthodox Church is very much a part of that. And most of the people who were educated and young and thinking about the West and would have been opponents to this war, they left a long time ago. The biggest long-term, I said this a year ago, the biggest long-term implication of this war for Russia is that it lost the best of it and the best and brightest. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly younger and educated people who had the means to leave, got on an airplane or got in a car and drove to Georgia or Finland or went to Istanbul where they didn't need a visa, and they went on from there, and they are making their new lives. They are not interested in coming back. But those who are left are tolerating it because it's a huge price to pay if you get arrested for saying something against this war. And of course, the big question about Putin is that if something were to happen to Putin, who would follow him? Shoigu is a sycophant. People would have thought, well, Prigozhin, he got rid of Prigozhin, and I'm not sure Prigozhin would have been better than Putin. So it's a devil we know and a devil we don't know kind of a problem. Khodorkovsky, the billionaire who was spent 10 years in prison and is now in exile, I mean, he might come, Navalny might be released from prison and they might elect him president, and Thomas Jefferson might be reincarnated tomorrow. But not likely. So at the end of the day, Putin's strategy remains, I'm just going to keep doubling down and wait until 2024. Next slide, please. There is no exit ramp. And this is where we come to the issue of values that we place as Americans on this, and how it relates to the values we hold within this church. My job is not to preach here today. Leanne does that much better. But peace is not free. It comes at a price. And what is the price, and who is going to pay that price? I mean, we had peace in Afghanistan. We withdrew, right? Who's paying that price? The Afghan families that are still there. The girls who can't go to school and have no future. The people who have no food. They're paying a price. Do we have responsibility for that, or was it only the price we pay to keep our soldiers there? And Ukraine is different. We don't have soldiers there. So it's not entirely a parallel, but it does raise the same question. And when we decide to cut costs, who is paying what price? Now, there isn't going to be any help from Russia. Lavrov, foreign minister at the UN just the other day, said there's nothing to negotiate. In fact, he went as far as to say the United States, NATO, and the West, they're at war with Russia. And, oh, by that Black Sea grain deal, forget that. That's not happening again. We're not going to renew that. Next slide. Now, we got two zero-sum hard place rocks at each other. Unless one totally capitulates, raise your hand if you think you see any of that happening. Don't see any hands going up. That compromise is inevitable, right? At some point. When one side decides that, well, okay, maybe I can cut my losses. I'm not going to get everything. Next slide. These are my principles. You had 5 Christian principles in the bulletin today, but these are my principles for this war. And I've written about this a couple of places. Whatever that compromise looks like, and I do believe there is going to be a compromise of some sort, it's just that neither side is even close to contemplating it. There's got to be respect for UN principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders. You heard that phrase before. By the way, that also comes from the UN Charter. And actually, we have an ally in that. It's called China. Because China has said to Putin, Xi Jinping has said to Putin, whatever resolution from this, it must respect UN Charter principles. Now that's Xi Jinping's way of saying, you got to get out of Dodge. Second, each country, and this is my view, and I understand it's a little controversial in some quarters, particularly hawkish ones, and I'm kind of a hawk here. Each country, including Russia, and I will underline it, post-Putin Russia, because I don't think we can deal with Russia at all, Putin has legitimate security interests. Russia does have legitimate security interests. To the extent that it justifies what it has done, no. To the extent that it justifies what Putin says he wants to do with Ukraine, no. But Russia as a country, as a nation, has legitimate security interests. And I like to remind some of my hawks that, okay, there may be something in the Russian character that gives rise to a Vladimir Putin, but we've also dealt with other Russian leaders in the past. We ended the Cold War with a Russian leader who was a protege of the KGB director at the time, Gorbachev. We resolved the Cold War without a shot. So I'm a glass half full guy. And the glass, I think, is half full on that point, but it's not going to happen with Vladimir Putin. And the last core principle here is, and this is to those who would wish us to just withdraw and come home. Or as Mr. DeSantis said, well, this is just a territorial dispute. Beware of power vacuums. And if we withdraw, just like we did in Afghanistan, just like we have done in other places, when we withdraw, there will be a power vacuum. And there's something about physics and politics that's the same. When you create a vacuum, something will fill it. And if you don't like what fills it, but you created the vacuum, then you get to own it. Beware of power vacuums. You might not like what you get. Last slide. Or next to last slide. No Munich. We cannot, this is my view, we cannot do what we did in 1938, when in the interests of peace, we gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler. No Yalta. We cannot do what we did in 1945 when we acquiesced, when Stalin insisted that he needed a buffer zone in Poland to protect him from a future Germany. Oh yes, we'll have free elections. And Poland went from being occupied by Germany to being occupied by Russia, by the Soviet Union. And Poland was not consulted in that. The exile government in London was not consulted in that. That was the deal that Roosevelt and Churchill made with Stalin in 1945, early 1945. Why? Because we didn't want to continue the war on our own, and we needed Stalin's help, we thought. This is before Alamogordo and the atomic bomb. This was before, this is when we thought we needed Stalin's help to defeat Japan. So we can't have a Munich, which is giving Putin territory that he gained by force. We cannot do a Yalta, which is doing a deal without engaging Kyiv in the process. And that leads to the last one, which, as many of your historians know, that at the end of World War I, the German military and the German right wing launched a stab-in-the-back propaganda campaign. We won the war, we were stabbed in the back. I'm not talking about elections, by the way. We were stabbed in the back by those people in the West and those who collaborated with them in the West. We cannot create a political condition for that to happen within Ukraine. And the political circumstances in Ukraine are such that if Kyiv decides, if Zelensky is not consulted, or if he is and he gives away what the Ukrainian people think is too much, which at this point would be almost anything, then there could be troubles inside of Ukraine and right-wing revanchism in Ukraine as well. So that's not all very good news. Last slide, please. One of my favorite writers is Reinhold Niebuhr. And this is a quote that is often used to talk about democracy, but as I say at the bottom, it also not only applies to domestic governance, but it also applies to international relations. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. But man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. If we're inclined to deal unjustly with our fellows, the possession of power aggravates that, and that's why irresponsible and uncontrolled power is the greatest source of injustice. So here we sit, as a church committed to peace, amongst other things, peace and justice. And I would argue that how we approach this conflict is a challenge for us on how we balance those things. Because the clarion call for peace at any price generally means that somebody else is paying that price. And I think the consequences for America's role in the world, and we can have a separate conversation of what that should look like, but the consequences for America's role in the world, the consequences for power balances in the world, the consequences for other powers to fill political vacuums, the consequences for erstwhile allies to decide they need nuclear weapons to defend themselves since we're not. All of those can be very ugly black futures if this goes terribly wrong. So with that, I don't know, see, is it almost noon? Is that what that says up there? So that leaves us a little bit of time for questions. I'm happy to take questions, whatever you have, slings and arrows, whatever. Thank you.
Okay, so a couple of questions. First one is North Korea. Well, and I didn't see anything South Korea either, but North Korea has started talking to Russia, and looks like they're going to start giving them weapons, or they may have already started giving them weapons. We don't know. But question, I guess, to you is, what do you think the possibility of this expanding to a world war is in light of this escalation, overt escalation from North Korea? Who knows what China's doing back there?
Excellent question. I'm not losing any sleep about this becoming a global war at this point, for a couple of reasons. One, it's not so much an escalation. North Korea is not going to send troops. I'm not sure the Russian military wants North Korean troops. But it's mostly what North Korea has a lot of, which is, some not very accurate Scud missiles. It's mostly artillery shells and things like that. The rate of consumption of artillery shells in this war is difficult certainly not easy for Russia to keep up with, because their production rates are much lower than what we're capable of. And throughout the West, the United States and in Europe, we've had to ramp up production of things because we didn't have that production rate before. So it really is, the biggest contribution North Korea is going to make is, artillery, ammunition, and other kinds of things. It isn't going to escalate the war. It does enable Russia to keep doing what it's doing. Now, the second part of that question, which is really important, is, can this escalate, and what about China? I've always believed that China, and I think right now even more, the most important thing for Xi Jinping and all of his predecessors is to maintain stability in the region. Because China faces huge demographic and economic challenges, near term and long term. Xi Jinping has tried to create kind of his own power center. He has, he didn't show up at the UN. He didn't show up at the G20 and so on. But he is not going to be encouraging an escalation of this war. In fact, he's been encouraging Putin to de-escalate this war in ways that he could kind of get away with. So the relationship between China and Russia, China is the senior partner in that relationship, and he'll happily sell stuff to Putin, and he'll happily buy Putin's energy, although not at market prices. And that's about as far as that relationship is going. For the last year or so, at every possible point, Xi Jinping has expressed a desire for this thing to be resolved in accordance with UN principles, and absolutely no way getting involved with nuclear weapons. And he said that openly to Putin several times. So I'm sleeping well on that count. This light is so bright I can't see who's here.
As a new member, I haven't heard you teach before. Impressive, and thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
And I had a couple quick questions. One is, as a Joe Schmo, what news sources would someone like me access for a fair, a balanced, a factual, ongoing account?
If you really want to get into the weeds, which I'm sure is not what you're asking, there is a website called the Institute for the Study of War out of London. It has been detailing all those maps I showed you. Since February 22, they have maps and campaign analyses and what's happening in every day of the war. I'm not suggesting, Lisa, that you go look at that, but if you want to know really what's happening on the ground, and it's all from unclassified sources, that is excellent. I mean, my sources largely, I mean, every day I read New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, you know, and I'm on the internet, you know, looking at things. You know, when you see a Ukrainian public opinion poll, you kind of take that with a grain of salt, you know, and you do the normal kind of stuff. But yeah, you know, what we used to call mainstream media. But you know, and there are academic pieces. There was a piece in, it was either the New York Times or Washington Post this morning by Stephen Walt, who is a conservative, who wants us to cut our losses. Stephen Walt he's a conservative, he's a realist. He once said, you know, the realists are the new doves. In other words, we should be retrenching in the world, and so on. And he's made that argument. Other people like John Mearsheimer has made arguments, this is all our fault. I totally disagree with that. But Stephen Walt makes an interesting case. But the nice thing about things like New York Times and Washington Post, is you'll get pieces from all sides on all this.
One more thing.
Oh yes, well, you had another one, Lisa.
I'm sorry, yeah, I did. Just either for the people who organize the forum or for you in a future speech maybe, I've been pretty alarmed about all the press in the last 2 weeks about the red flags for the demise of the United Nations. You know, there's been quite a few more buzz on that in the stuff I read, and I'd like to know more about that sometime, not for this question, I'm sure. But
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the UN is an interesting animal. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
I have two, and they're not directly related to military action.
That's okay.
One is, what's your take on this struggle in the House over the defense bill, okay, and its impact? And the second one is, you've talked about us upping production in order to support Ukraine. How does that relate to the Fed and their playing around with the interest rate and the fact that unemployment continues to remain employment continues to remain fairly strong? It seems to me they're kind of fighting against one another.
Okay, remind me of the first one again.
First one is the defense bill and the
Oh,
House.
yes. Okay, well, I had more luck with that one. I don't want to say anything bad about anybody in Congress. My frustration with that is that the people who are playing games on that, they don't care about the defense bill. They don't care what's in the defense bill. It's like Tommy Tuberville is holding up all these nominations because, you know, the Pentagon has gone woke or something like that. And particularly in his case about the Pentagon's policy that if a woman is being a service member is in a state that doesn't allow abortion, then they will help that woman, that couple, go out of state to do that. And of course, that is total anathema to that end of the political spectrum. And that's what Tommy Tuberville is holding up all these things about. A lot of it also has to do with ego, because if I'm holding things up, Matt Gaetz, I think it's a lot of that is about ego. He has got a bigger agenda in the House. He doesn't like Kevin McCarthy. He thinks Kevin McCarthy has broken the deals, although Kevin McCarthy made a deal with the President of the United States about the budget, but it's the conservatives in the Republican caucus who don't like that. The problem is that given the narrow Republican majority in the House, what was it, 4 or 5 votes, and some members of Congress, because of medical issues, aren't likely to come and vote, that Kevin McCarthy can't lose many votes. And there's, a dozen or 2 dozen really hardline conservatives in the Republican caucus who have the wherewithal to block a majority unless the other Republicans can get Democrats to vote along with them. And at the moment, the Democratic Party has got its own priorities, which the Republicans aren't going to listen to. And therefore, the Democrats don't have any incentive to bail the moderate Republicans out, because even what the moderate Republicans want to put in that bill is total anathema. So, gee, this is another zero-sum problem. Now, there are people that are going to try and I still hold out some hope that through this other resolution in which Democrats and Republicans bring it straight to the floor for a vote, they might find some way of getting appropriations through, or at least some continuing resolution to keep the government open. Because the other reality is that the Republican Party will pay a lot more than the Democratic Party will if the government shuts down. But the problem is, and again, this is like, who's paying what price, right? Because most of the folks who are really the hardliners in the House come from such safe districts that they will not suffer a political cost. They will not. And that's the problem, because others are going to pay political costs, and people in the United States are going to pay a huge cost, but they don't care. And it's not because they have a view about the defense budget or any other kind of thing. It's because they have a political axe to grind. I'll try and answer the other one. The Fed's going to keep interest rates up. They keep signaling that they're going to do that. In Europe, the European Central Bank has said, we're done. But the Fed's going to keep, there may be another rate or two. It hurts me, hurts others of us in this room, I'm sure. But that's because inflation has been stubborn, partly because of high employment, like you're talking about, and that does make the bill go up in terms of the government going to industry and saying, we need more 155 millimeter howitzer shells, or whatever it is. For the most part, we have been working on stocks of weaponry that we've had. They were on the shelf. They were in your proverbial garage, right? And but those are pretty much emptied out. And the same thing in Europe. They've pretty much emptied out. Most of the East European countries have gotten rid of their Soviet-era arsenal. And now they want F-16s and F-35s. So I don't know how those things lash together, but each one of them is a separate economic reality, and what it means is that it makes it more expensive for us to come up with that weaponry, and the same thing with Britain and Germany. And Germany may be going into is facing a possible recession, so that, again, the financial constraints are going to make the politics more difficult, but I don't think at the end of the day it's going to overwhelm the political imperative of staying with that NATO pledge. Lisa.
Yeah, springboarding off that last question, last year a lot of problems with global inflation, very much linked to the price of oil, and the oil, because of the constraints coming out of Russia, and then how that affects European Union and the other players. Where are we at in this oil picture and Europe, et cetera?
Excellent question. This was an energy war, and some ways was, and Bill, this is, in some ways, in terms of energy and food, this has long been a global war. And an information war. But with respect to energy, basically Europe got through last winter, a number of ways, a lot of liquid natural gas. There were some new pipelines that were put together very quickly. it was a milder winter. B, there were stocks and storage that were kept up, but there was a lot of liquid natural gas, a lot of it coming from the United States. And we and our allies worked together to build fairly rapidly some liquid natural gas terminals because they're rather specialized. So that was the main reason we got through that. And, people rationed and people were supportive of the effort and they understood why that was. And yes, I think in this country the price of energy has gone up. But I noticed that between yesterday and earlier a week ago, the price of gas at the pump went down about 10%. It goes down about 40 cents, right? Who knew? I don't know why that is. Oil is a fluid commodity and runs around the world. There have been, production has not decreased. Some of the oil companies in the United States who initially said, when Biden went to them and said, hey, you need to ramp up production of oil. And they said, well, I only think this is a short-term problem, and I don't really want to invest to bring those wells back online because in the long run, it's not going to pay for itself, right? And Biden doesn't have the power to tell them. He just says, would you pretty please? And they said no. But some of them have started to bring some stuff online. So there's been increased U.S. production as best I understand, but I'm not the expert on this issue.
We'll have time for this last question here.
Hi, Judith.
Some time ago, at least 20 years ago, we read as a congregation, we read a book called Is There Such Thing as a Just War? And one of the lines that I remember from that book, and I'm sorry, I should have looked up Deuteronomy, there's a great line that runs something like, kill your enemies, but leave their crops. And so, winter, this is really, I'm all about food and agriculture. Winter is coming. Heat is one thing, but if you don't have any food, you're not going to make it. And to me, that is a major concern, not only for Ukraine, and I have forgotten now how many people elsewhere in the world depend on those exports that the Russians have now been bombing. So can you address how we're going to feed?
That's a huge problem. Kill the enemy but keep their crops. Great line. There was a grain deal. There are some workarounds on some of the shipments. Trying to get Ukraine is able to maneuver in the western end of the Black Sea to get stuff out over land, but not in the way that they were able to before. Other countries have ramped up grain production, but you're absolutely right. Most countries in Africa are 100% dependent upon Russian and Ukrainian grain. Now, what the Russians have done is taken over a lot of the grain, and they're still shipping it. So the Russians are basically saying, well, I'll provide you the grain, right? But you've got to continue to support me in the war. And one of the diplomatic frustrations around the world is that so many countries in the world are trying to stay on keep peace with both sides in this thing. Well, it's not my problem, right? So that's ameliorated some of it. UN food programs have ramped up, to try to ramp up production. So my sense is that the crisis is not as dire as it looked to be about 15 months ago, but that may also be a function of, but I'm not drilling, I haven't been drilling into the details, Judith, so that may just be a function of what is and is not in the press. The Russians have been selling a lot of grain, and the Ukrainians have been screaming about, that's our grain. But in terms of, if you're in Ghana or Ethiopia or Nigeria and you're getting grain from, you don't really care whether it's Russian or Ukrainian, or coming from the food program. It's not coming because of increased production in the U.S., I think, just because we've had our own meteorological issues. So that's the best I can do, and an excellent question, Judith. Thank you all. It's 12:15. It's time to go.
Thank you, Scott.
Come next week for Polly.
Thank you once again for keeping us up to date, Sky. We'll see you all next week.